Just an administrative note. Anyone is welcome to attend this conference. All we ask is that you register. We don't care about your political views. You're welcome to participate, but crashing a conference, frankly, is rude. So I hope everyone is now calmed down, and we'll pick up where we were. So, I've introduced Ambassador Teft, I've introduced Ambassador Wood. Natalia Arnaud is the president of the Free Russia Foundation, based in Washington, D.C., and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm the chairman of her board. Next to her is Laura Cooper, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Defense, responsible for this region. And last but certainly not least is Maria Logan, who is with the Open Russia Foundation in London. We're thrilled to have all five of you here today, and what we'll do is we'll just start with a conversation and then we'll go to the audience. So let me start, Natalia and Maria, with the two of you if we can. If you could talk to us a little bit, maybe Maria, we'll start with you. The elections that took place for Moscow Municipal Council on Sunday, the protests, give us your take on what this means and where we go, and then I'll go to Natalia.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. This is my second time at this conference, and well, I can say that you couldn't imagine this last year. So I guess time is changing, and I was thinking through this whole conference that, you know, Georgians are just so lucky because we cannot have this event, this conference, an open discussion like this inside Russia. So we often arrange conferences like this and spaces to discuss about current Russia outside of Russia, including Georgia. So I want to thank all of you here for hosting civil society from Russia here in Georgia and allow us free discussion here. So I hope this freedom continues and we can meet next year with no provocation. So on summer events in Russia, so it's been very interesting developments. In Russia, it's sort of become a tradition that, you know, August is it becomes very sort of interesting and active, and this year was no exception. We saw, starting in July, we saw people gathering on the streets of Moscow. We saw 60,000 people on one day when people were protesting against the non-registration of independent candidates for the Moscow Duma. And it was not only in Moscow, it was across the country as Russia was preparing for municipal elections and regional elections in Russia. And this is sort of a new phenomenon because this is not the presidential elections, this is not the federal elections into the Russia Duma. These are regional, local elections, and all of a sudden Russians do care. So I think this is an important development in itself. The elections took place this Sunday. Opposition in Russia, non-systemic opposition, so I don't count the communist and the party of Zhirinovsky, can say that there are small victories, and we don't have a lot of victories within the opposition, but we can say that this time the opposition was managed to take the majority from the ruling party, United Russia, as United Russia lost 13 seats in Moscow Duma. We can also claim victory in St. Petersburg because although the pro-party or the Kremlin candidate won the elections in St. Petersburg, despite all the, with all the falsifications that took place there. Nevertheless, there on the municipal level, there's over 100 independent candidates that were able to register, that receive assistance from a foundation like, or organization like Open Russia and other. And we can say that there are people, new faces that will take seats within St. Petersburg municipalities. So that's another victory. I would say another big development is that we, as people in Moscow were protesting, against this non-election, we also saw a lot of new faces. Some of you who followed the summer events saw Ilya Yashin, Dmitry Gudkov, Yulia Galyamina being arrested and serving. I think overall there's over 229 days that they spent under administrative arrest, while people were gathering more and more on the streets. And we saw new leaders, we saw new faces, and I think this is a big gain of the opposition from this summer. So overall, I think it was a very positive summer. We're all inspired by small victories, and I think it's also important to mention that we shouldn't forget about the repressions and the force that the authorities used during the summer. There are now 6 people who received real-time sentences for participating in protests. And these sentences are not 60 days or 30 days. The largest sentence is 5 years. There are 8 cases more that are pending. So I think it's another important lesson to learn from these events is that the authorities are not going to stop. They will not compromise on any political demands, and they will continue to put people in jail. So it's extremely important that we watch how these cases develop in Russia.
And Natalia, maybe if you can pick up on that line about the crackdown, the repression, the methods that the authorities are using, including against Free Russia Foundation, and what's happening from that perspective.
Yes, thank you, David, for inviting me to this conference, and thank you to the panelists, to Nino and her team, and the audience. Hello, Georgia. Thank you very much for being committed to freedom and democracy, and thus inspiring us pro-democracy Russians, despite some alliance of patriots who are patriots of some other country, and I can guess which one. Before I start, I actually would like, I think it's a very important thing to determine, agree on the terms, because in my opinion, we should discuss the subject of our panel, Russia. I strongly believe there are 2 different Russias. Russia of Vladimir Putin and his cronies. Putin's Russia, the Kremlin, current Putin's regime, current Russian government. Putin's Russia suppresses any dissent at home. Putin's Russia buys the so-called propaganda people, so-called journalists. Putin's Russia attacks its neighbors. Putin's Russia very often imprisons and sometimes murders political opponents and independent journalists. Putin's Russia meddles elections, not only foreign, but predominantly domestic ones, like it happened today in Russia. But actually, there is another Russia. Russia that is democratically aspired, committed to universal values and human rights. Russia, which is outraged with the level of propaganda, of corruption and arbitrariness of the authorities. Russia, a murdered opposition leader Boris Nemtsov believed in. Russia, my team is striving for. Me, Vladimir Kormurza, who was poisoned twice, my team here in Tbilisi, Yegor Kuroptev and Koля Levshits, many, many others. This Russia, it's hundreds of truly independent candidates that were running in last elections. It's thousands of activists working every day for human rights organizations, for civil society organizations, for Navalny movement, for Open Russia movement, environmental movements. This is hundreds of thousands of people protesting this summer, last spring, many years, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, all over Russia, for free and fair elections, against corruption of the authorities, against the war in Ukraine, to release Kremlin's political prisoners, including Ukrainian hostages of the Kremlin. This is also Russia of millions of young people. They were born after Putin rose to power. Last month, we celebrated 20 years of Putin's rule. These young people were born after that. They don't know any other reality, only him on TV screen. In 2018, it was first time they could go and vote in this electoral ceremony. And they don't know any other reality. They don't know what it is to have media freedom, political pluralism, free and fair elections. They have never seen a truly democratic changeover of the government. But they exist, and that's why it's so important to differentiate between Putin's Russia and free Russia, which is, I'm sure, soon to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Laura, let me come to you because I want to segue a little bit more toward the higher level issues. There's a lot of talk about Russian military buildup, military spending, new missile systems, all of these things. How much of this is seen from the Pentagon is real and how much of it is bluff?
Well, I would have to say, unfortunately, a lot of it is real. So Russia has been embarked on a military modernization effort going back at least a decade, but actually longer. And even as we see the manifestation of Russian military presence here in Georgia, roughly 10,000 forces here in the occupied territories, we see a Crimean peninsula that is absolutely bristling with military capability. Everything ranging from, submarines and combat aircraft to air defense systems and Caliber-class cruise missiles, coastal defense missiles. So the frontline states that we've been talking so much about are witnessing the impact of that military modernization. But it goes beyond that. Russia's been investing in cyber and electronic warfare systems. Russia has been investing in a whole host of other access and area denial systems. And then, of course, we all saw Putin's March 2018 speech, his saber-rattling speech, where he unveiled a number of capabilities. Now, those are not real quite yet. They are in development, but they are absolutely in development. And it's, things like an undersea drone that it has an intercontinental range and carries nuclear capability, is nuclear powered, so would essentially offer a tidal wave of radioactivity as it targets a city or a port across the Atlantic. So these are real capabilities. I would like to say, we do though have an excellent strategy and a good approach now because we have the National Defense Strategy, which calls on us to take very seriously great power competition and to take seriously how we're going to address everything from these high-end capabilities to shoring up NATO, fortifying NATO, so as an alliance we are deterring further aggression, and then dealing with that coercive and disruptive toolkit. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and we'll come back to these issues on how we're responding and dealing with this. John and Andrew, let me come to the two of you and ask you about Putin and the system. How much of this is systemic? How much of this is driven by Putin and the clique around him? Maybe John, start with you.
Thanks very much, David. Working? Whoop. No, it takes a second, sorry. I thought it was actually nice you have three young ladies here with expertise, and then you got the two old gray-haired guys here sitting here at the end. Yeah, that's right, you are. Three. It's an excellent question, David, because obviously the clans, as they're called, are already, they're not only competing with each other, but I think they're all competing with each other with a view to 2024, depending on what happens. Mr. Putin says he will leave. There's probably as many people out there who don't think that will happen as there are people who think it will happen. And if he does leave, what's the procedure? Is it a replacement of the a la Yeltsin and Putin, or is it something else? There's lots of different variants on this. And the political clans, and even more so, I think, but I'll defer also on this one to Andrew, the different groups within the Siloviki are already at it, and you can read in the literature that comes out You don't see the whole picture, but you see pieces of it, and you can put it all together. So I think in some ways you already have this jockeying for position, is maybe the best way to put it. And of course, as the ladies have described, on the streets, people are going out and saying they want a say in this. And they, started with the Moscow City Council, but how far this will go now, I don't know. I think when we had this discussion here last year, I think we finished, if I remember, on the question of young people. Not just young people in Russia, but young people in Georgia, in Ukraine. We've all seen what's just happened in Ukraine, and we saw a manifestation here in Georgia. And at least for me, the role of young people, this changing generation that you so ably described in Russia, is really starting to play a role. And neither I nor anyone else can tell you precisely how this is going to play. But I'm 2 years away now from Moscow, but even before I left, you could see some of the people in the political elite already adjusting and jockeying their own positions to be ready to capitalize on some of the changes that come ahead. Now, I realize I haven't given you a clear, but it is a very murky situation, but I think you've got a very fluid situation, which has only been made more fluid by the result of the demonstrations on the streets in Russia. Maybe Andrew has some other ideas.
I'd like to begin with the sarcasm. Many of our leaders in the West call for warm relations. Warm relations have a very broad meaning. You could say that this demonstration here was a warm relation in some sense, but precisely the sense that we need to understand that the nature of the regime controlling the country that we are seeking warm relations with, or relations of some sort, is vital. The prospect seems to me, coming towards 2024, there's a good deal of division. Sorry,
put it like this.
Put it like this.
Like you're singing.
Well, I could sing if you like, but I would warn the audience not to listen. The nature of the regime, I think, is now under threat. What Putin has left is a dangerous emptiness. He has no further constructive means of improving the economic performance or essentially changing the societal mix. His response is so far, and I believe will continue to be, one of increasing authoritarianism, trying to suppress debate, trying to suppress decision, exactly as those people coming in wish to do just now. I think, however, that in the longer term he cannot succeed. If you go through the various siloviki or various contenders who might succeed him, they will face the dilemma that if they offer some sort of change, that will be disintegrative, and if they offer no change, that will increase resistance to what is Russia's fate. At present, we're supposed to ask the question, what next? The answer in Russia is nobody knows, but it could be very disruptive. Even if the Archangel Gabriel came down to take charge, the institutions are now so empty and so disintegrated that he would have an extraordinarily difficult task to perform. Reform, change in Russia is going to be very difficult and very dangerous for us all. So what we have to do is not just to be on our guard, but to take note of the possibilities and debate among ourselves and consider it more seriously than I think we have done in the recent past. Calling for warm relations with a vacuum, and a dangerous vacuum, is not enough. Thank you.
Maria, let me ask you, is it fair to say that Putin has become a hostage of his own system, which is to say that he can't afford to leave power but doesn't know how to stay in power?
I think it's right. I mean, I don't think anyone is expecting Putin to leave voluntarily. I think Russia is watching now the sort of the Kazakhstan scenario, how things are developing there, because this is and I think Putin is watching it as well. I think what happened in Ukraine is interesting. They managed to get through this election, and it was free and fair elections. People got what they wanted, but also it's interesting to see what will happen with the, I think it's 13 criminal cases files against Poroshenko. I think Putin is watching that too. So I think Russia has now had Putin for 20 years. And I think it's very interesting how these experiments outside will influence Putin's decision closer to 2024. I think even Putin doesn't know, and he doesn't have to make a decision today, because he knows that until 2024, probably his seat is safe. But as we get close, I agree with you, Andrew, as we get closer to that 2024, there's more and more tensions internally, because Putin is sort of becoming less and less of a guarantor long term, and there are more and more sort of maybe some ambitious people who want to think maybe he should be someone else.
Natalia, go ahead. You want to jump in, but let me also ask you to touch on the spread of protests throughout the country. This is not just a Moscow phenomenon that we've been seeing.
Yes, exactly. And I'm completely right. Putin can be disruptive, and all these malign activities in the West and influence operations, they are very concerning and huge. But domestically, Putin is not as strong. And he is now, his ratings plummeted in historic low since 2000. If he was that popular, he would be, during this election campaign, it would be enough just to have him on the poster with any candidates from the ruling party. No, instead he was biking in Crimea. And the ruling party is also, it's now a toxic brand. This year in Moscow, for Moscow City Council, there were 0 candidates running from the ruling party United Russia. They were running as independents, and the website of United Russia were deleting their profiles. And actually everywhere in the regions they were trying to do the same, run as independents. Because previously, already in last year, they had many problems in regions. Very often they clean the political landscape completely, getting rid of real candidates, but and putting only spoilers on the ballot. And people would vote very often for the spoilers instead of the party candidate. But for me, what is the most significant about these protests that were happening in summer, that again, the protest itself, it overgrown its original trigger, disqualification of candidates to the Moscow City Council. It was already protest against this outdated political system. For the first time ever, regions started to support Moscow. What is very important is that people are losing fear. Before that, people wouldn't go that much to unauthorized rallies. Now they didn't care. Even despite all this police brutality, absolutely unprecedented, when they were beating young children, women, old people, nevertheless, more and more people would come, would show the solidarity, and Moscow protests were supported by regions. But for me, another number, which is, I think, very important, and why I was saying about this new Russia, free Russia, because I think where the Kremlin has its problem, the fundamental problem, is that starting from 2016, Levada Center, but also pro-Kremlin pollsters, they show huge demand, huge desire of Russians to have normal relations with neighbors and with the West. It was 71% in 2016 and 79% now. And if to think about it, it's about 100 million people wanting normal relations, and that's why it's important not to alienate them. So Kremlin has huge problems. They are not as strong as everybody portrays it. It doesn't enjoy like 86% of support. It's not as popular. Kremlin's propaganda is not as powerful any longer. It doesn't work. It's already that unprecedented. And they're using the same, they're recycling the same tricks, same bikes, same wrestling, some new animals, and again, diving, and instead of 2,000 BCM for taking out, 5,000 BCM for so again, nobody buys it. What is more important, Russian youth doesn't watch TV. All these billions were in vain.
Laura, let me turn to you as we maybe shift a little bit toward what we do with this situation that we face. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that the Pentagon has with its Russian counterparts? There are obviously issues where we have an interest to try to avoid any clashes, any problems, whether it's in Syria or elsewhere. What kind of relationship do we have? How often are we in touch with the military?
Okay, so this is an important question, especially in the context of Ukraine, because our relationship changed dramatically with the Russian military after 2014. And what we have in place right now in the United States is actually a statutory prohibition on military-to-military cooperation between the U.S. military and the Russian Federation. That it is possible to waive that in the interest of national security, and there are some carve-out areas. We work closely together on POW MIA recovery operations, for instance. But by and large, we are not in a cooperative military-to-military relationship. But it is absolutely critical that we avoid miscalculation and that we avoid misperception that could lead to escalation should we get into a conflict. So we have established channels at multiple levels. Most of the discussions are focused on Syria, where we have forces that are in close proximity to Russian forces, and we absolutely want to avoid any miscalculation. So we have a channel at the working level at our Combined Air Operations Center, talking with the Russians very frequently to deconflict operations, but we also have channels at the 3-star and at the level of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, talking with his Russian counterpart, Gerasimov. Indeed, also at NATO, there is a Gerasimov channel for now General Walters, the Supreme Allied Commander. So we do have ways to talk to them. We also have convened interagency discussions where the Defense Department plays a role, along with our state and NSC counterparts, talking about strategic stability. We think it's very important to address threat perceptions and make sure that we are able to call out concerns about Russian behavior or capabilities. Some of the capabilities that I just mentioned are, capabilities of concern that we want to be able to discuss with our Russian counterparts. And then the other piece that we've been very careful about recently is communicating, usually via our mission in Moscow, with the Russians directly, to communicate our plans regarding exercises. We do some very large-scale exercises right now. This is designed to improve NATO interoperability or interoperability with partners like Ukraine, like Georgia. So with these exercises, we want to avoid any misperception on the part of Russia that there is a conflict looming. So we notify them. We've called on them to do the same with us. We are not there yet. They still do SNAP exercises, but this is the direction we'd like to head in.
So, John and Andrew, Laura just talked about the need to avoid accidents, to avoid conflicts in various arenas, but we obviously clash on a number of issues. So how do we handle the situation given the current leadership in Russia, maybe from a U.S. perspective and then a European perspective?
I've always felt that we needed to maintain a level of engagement at the political as well as the military level, and I always give huge credit to not just General Dunford and the 3 stars, but the guys who are down in the Combined Air Traffic Center. These people are doing great work for our country and for the world because they're out there, Russian speakers, talking to their Russian counterparts, making sure that planes don't bump into each other over Syria and the things like that. I think on the political level, I'm not very optimistic much is going to happen between our two countries, between the United States and Europe, but I defer to Andrew on that one, at least for a little while. We defer to you on Europe, Andrew. So no, I'm just joking. I think yeah, that's right. You're
Europe
always
is a continent, not an organization.
That's right. I got it. I was glad to see that there have been these contacts both with John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and some of the arms control talks. I don't think, at least from what I know, that we're making huge progress, but this is one of those cases where it's better to be talking and finding out. And I was a longtime proponent, even in the darkest days back in 2014, 15, and 16, to try to get these stability talks going. And again, and I remember we had one before I left Moscow. Our Undersecretary for Political Affairs met with the Deputy Foreign Minister, and I remember reading over the memorandum of conversation, and there wasn't much there. It was kind of prepared pieces on both sides. But the fact that they were talking and that they could at least lay out some of these things and perhaps lay the basis for a time when maybe things will move in a more positive way. I'm hopeful, for example, that maybe there'll be changes in the Russian policy based on Ukraine. Now, I'm not holding my breath. I understand very clearly what happened. And, you know, I'm glad to see the prisoners exchanged. Whether the Putin government is ready to move ahead further on this with President Zelensky and his people to stop the horrible carnage in Donbass is a real question, and I don't know that answer any more than I think anybody else does. But perhaps it'll do it. And my own view is you have to be ready, but we go step by step. We don't make any concessions until we see what the Russian government is prepared to do vis-a-vis Ukraine or perhaps any of these other issues, arms control, cyber warfare, all of the things that separate us.
Andrew, before I come to you, John, let me push you and be a little provocative.
Okay.
They attacked our election. They interfered in our politics. They're propping up Maduro in Venezuela. They side with Assad, killing civilians there. They've invaded this country. They've invaded Ukraine. On what basis can we talk with them about anything?
Well, I agree. There's a lot. Let me just use one of the examples, and that's the interference in our elections. I remember in the fall of 2016, it was an October Friday, I remember when our Secretary for Homeland Security and General Clapper, head of intelligence, put out the first official statement about the attacks on the Democratic Party and the interference in our election. And I just happened to be going in to see a very senior Russian official the following Tuesday, and it was like, oh, this is just another thing. And I said, you know, think about this. Think of what this is, the impact of this is going to be in our country. It's not just add to your list of disagreements between the US and Russia. This is going to go to the core of American perceptions of Russia. Now, it didn't take rocket science for me to figure that out. You could anticipate what was going to happen. And what we see today in the United States, Russia complains about the Senate and the House passing sanctions resolutions. But my wife Mariella's family lives out in Kansas, and when we go out and visit in Kansas, those folks are pretty angry over what they see. They're not as informed as people in this room are, but they understand that Russia was threatening the fundamentals of American democracy. And you're not going to get political support in our country unless you've got people who see the value in this. And there's a long way to go, obviously, to get to that point. My point, David, is that on all of these, I'd rather at least be talking and communicating than having a vacuum and then something crazy or terrible happening.
So it's a perfect segue, jaw instead of war. But Andrew, let me also, in turning to you, be a little provocative. They poisoned Litvinenko, they tried to kill Skripal. Russian money has maybe not taken over, but certainly a large part in London. So from your perspective, how do you see it?
Well, on the last charge, I would have to plead guilty. Discussion at all levels, but senior level particularly, is proper and inevitable, but you have to know who you're talking to. And it is very foolish to prepare your conversation with a promise that you're going to improve things. You have to be clear about what it is you wish to achieve and how to achieve it. Without that, you're allowed to be trapped in rather empty rhetoric, like Russia is a European country, which it certainly is, to be swayed by the fact that Putin claims to have 60% of the population behind him, though I think only about 30% who trust him. And you have to be defined in your objectives, including on arms control, but they would certainly include trying to avoid clashes in the air over the Baltic Sea or something like that. That's perfectly fair, though probably better managed at a technical level. Ignoring them completely and being over-polite are both sins. We have to take them as they are and judge them and our actions accordingly. It's quite easy, and I knew Mr. Milosevic very well, to go into someone that you know is at least, let's say, habitually untruthful, and feel that you're seeing the great man, in this case in Yugoslavia or is in Serbia, and to feel flattered. It's equally very easy to go into the Kremlin with all that gold and ultra-tall guards standing around and so on and so forth, and think this is a very important man. But just to take up what Natalia said, there are at least two Russias, and increasingly, I think the president of Russia is representing the repressive part of Russia and old-fashioned instincts. So be careful, but talk.
And since your country is still part of the EU, and of course you'll remain a member of NATO, do you see the EU staying together for the most part on sanctions? They've been renewed for a year this time, but do you see any slippage?
Well, there is potential for slippage there. I don't wish to get involved in discussions about Brexit, because that's always ruins any party. But there are countries in Europe that honestly believe that if you're nice to Putin, he will be nice to you. Well, he will, but while he picks your pocket.
Three more over here, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. Actually, Laura, keep the microphone if you would, because I want to stay on sort of foreign policy kinds of issues. An issue, obviously, that's been in the news of late is the INF Treaty and Russian cheating in general on arms control agreements. Is there any hope for future arms control talks? And maybe if you could talk a little bit about the INF issue as well. Sure.
So I talked about a range of new capabilities that Russia has developed or is developing, and obviously the missile, the intermediate range missile that is not compliant with the INF Treaty is one of those capabilities. And you know, it really is a major source of concern that it was developed in secret, that NATO has been unified in its condemnation of this development, and Russia continues to deny that it cheated, to use your word. So we have to be careful as we consider the future of arms control with Russia. That said, we're not abandoning arms control as an instrument of foreign policy, and we're considering what the options will be. One of the things that we have to look at when we look at any future agreement is how Russia's arsenal has evolved. I mean, right now, Russia has a growing non-strategic nuclear weapon arsenal that is not covered under the current New START treaty. And it is a major source of destabilizing concerns in Europe. We do not understand how Russia envisions using these weapons. We know that their arsenal is growing, and we know that they pose a threat to the European continent. So that's another factor that we have to think about. It's not just the cheating, it's also what capabilities do we need to address?
Great, thanks. All right, so let me turn to the two Russians on the panel and ask the two of you, what is it you would like to see the international community do that would be helpful to promoting democratic change and reform and liberalization inside your country?
Well, the number one thing is, and that probably doesn't apply necessarily to UK and US at the moment, but number one thing is stop legitimizing this regime, stop welcoming it, rolling up the red carpet. You know, we recently hear, you know, Macron talking about, or at least entertaining the idea of inviting Russia back, Putin's Russia back into G8. And that despite the fact that, you know, the reasons why they were kicked out, I mean, they're still valid. Russia is still in Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, we hear a lot about Russia as a threat. And again, to the point of Natalia, it's very important to distinguish what is this threat? Where is the enemy? Is this Russia as a whole? I don't think 144 million are the threat of the West. I think it's actually not that many people who are the threat, and they all pretty much occupy Kremlin as a whole. So you can identify much more precisely as where the threat is coming and identify measures that will deal with that threat, and that may not be necessarily military. It may be something else, maybe just criminal prosecutions in the West, going after the dirty money that is not just used to corrupt the West, but also used to manipulate the West, to spread the propaganda. And this is the unaccounted money in the West. And then with a lot of words about containing Russia, I think it's important to see that other Russia and look at it more carefully, because as always in Russia, change comes very fast. We cannot, in the opposition, we cannot necessarily bring that change much faster. I mean, we're dealing with the nuclear power and the captured state, but there are new people emerging, they're new generation. We're not sitting still, we're thinking how and what we're gonna do when that change comes. And it's very important for the West, I think, to watch and follow, because when it happens, there would be very little time. And the people who will come into power, they would have to make changes and a lot of reforms, and it's very important that the West will provide, its hand and help Russia to go through reforms quickly.
Natalia.
Yes, I agree with Maria. It's quite easy to identify those who occupied power in our country, and instead of having just a few people on the sanctions list, and I think 0 on Magnitsky Act in UK, for example, it's very important to put all these 200, 300 people. Also, I agree about not legitimizing this regime, but even more, don't prop it up, don't make it stronger. If somebody gives, somebody takes. It's not only that Kremlin brings this corruption, kleptocracy to the West, it's somebody who enables it, takes it. It's an army of, Western bankers and lobbyists and PR men and whoever. So this is an important thing. It's also, as we always say, we will deal with Putin ourselves. It's our job. The changes in Russia will be the most sustainable if they are done by the desire, by the demand of the Russian people. But we really ask the West and other countries to stay on your principles, to, again, not to enable it. I don't remember how much money, a lot of money given by the Western Germany to Eastern Germany, prolonged Berlin Wall for 10 years. I think Nord Stream 2 is propping up the regime. It's prolonging the regime for longer. And so this is an important thing. Just help us show this moral leadership. And again, we ask, of course, for moral solidarity with countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and others. Your examples are very inspiring for us.
Yeah, go ahead, John, please.
That one of the things that we did in Moscow when I was there, and I think the British and the other embassies did the same, was to do everything we could to reach out and cultivate young people. And we did that both in Moscow, where it was a little easier, but also traveling around the country. One of the first things the Putin administration did when I got there, and it wasn't related to me, but they closed down the Future Leaders Exchange Program. These are high school students who have gone to the United States, lived in family homes, and gone to high school in America. One of, I would argue, the most successful programs we had, and clearly people in the Kremlin decided this was very dangerous, and they did it. That said, we kept in touch with many of the thousands who had gone to the United States in the past, and I think worked that quite effectively. Last point was, every year I was in Moscow, I went to the Comic-Con that was held there. There's a bunch of young Russians who have built this, and every year I was accompanied by 3 or 4 young members of my staff dressed as Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman.
Are any of those pictures on the internet?
They actually are, David. They're some of the best ones I ever took.
Great. All right, let's open it up to questions. Arkady, you go first, and then Evelyn.
Thank you very much. Arkady Ostrovsky, I'm the Russia editor of The Economist. Very interesting panel, and the question is really to Ambassador Taft, Ambassador Wood, and to Laura. So given what Maria and Natalia said and what, John, you just started saying, given that we all recognize that Russia is going through a turbulent period, and it's started, and it's a bad transition, do you think the Western allies, let's put it this way, Western allies have coherent and consorted policy and, most importantly, tools of differentiating between those two Russias, getting the message effectively across? And that's the first part. And the second part is what Maria started talking about in the next cycle, that there will be a recognition of some of the mistakes that were made in the 90s. And as Strobe Talbot wrote in his memoirs, you know, when Clinton tells him how much more shit are we going to throw at Yeltsin's face, and how should the Western policy differ in the next political cycle from what we did in the 90s? Thank you.
Evelyn Farkas, German Marshall Fund. As some of you know, the Putin regime has been training its military and changing its laws so that the military can actually have authority to deal with civil disturbances. He's also been setting up special security forces for that purpose. How much do you worry about the possibility that the Russian government may at some point really seek to use the military against its citizens, and what would the response be among the personnel in those forces, do you think?
Michał Baranowski, GMF Warsaw, fantastic panel. Quick question about the relationship between Russia and China, something we haven't talked much about. I would like to ask probably Laura and maybe Ambassador Taft, Ambassador Wood, about your assessment on one hand. How do we describe it? How strong they are together? And then what do we do about it? Should we worry about it? Thanks.
I've been volunteered for the first question. I think the answer is unfortunately absolutely clear, that it's only just possibly beginning to dawn on Western analysts as well as Western leaders just how complex the change in Russia is going to be, particularly taking what Maria said about how rapid it could be. I think we're very used to the idea that somehow Putin is eternal, that Putin's successor will either be Putin or someone robotic dressed exactly like him. This is a delusion, and I think we've been very slow even to begin to consider that. I don't know how discussions would go among Western leaders about this sort of prospect, because as far as I know, it has not been discussed, but I turn the floor over to Ambassador Taft.
Arkady, you gave us a whole bunch of questions. I'm not sure we're going to touch all of them, but just to maybe pick up from Andrew and then go off on another tangent, and then I want to have a quick comment on China. Obviously, there are differences between leaders in the Western world and President Trump, President Macron, others. The differences are all there. You know, I'm not privy anymore to the discussions that go on at the G7. Obviously, there was lots of disagreements on a variety of different issues there. What I would say to you, though, is that at least when I was in Moscow, and this was not just recently, but when Sir Andrew was the British ambassador and I ended up being charge at the American embassy for 10 months, we really had a pretty good coordination. I will tell you this last time is when I was ambassador, I was invited fairly regularly to come over and talk to all of the EU ambassadors and discuss these issues. And then there were lots of different group meetings and stuff, and we would see each other and coordinate on the ground, as it were. And I think the fact that you saw the Russians throwing out lots of diplomats, not only Americans and others, and if you look carefully at who those people are, a lot of them at our embassy were political officers whose job it was to keep in touch with domestic political or other people like that. They knew exactly what they were trying to do because they wanted to cut off that kind of connection. With regard to China, obviously there's something very serious to worry about. Laura spends a lot of her time probably focusing on the Russia-Chinese military piece. That said, I've always had this sense that below the surface, there was in Moscow some, what's the best word, disgruntlement, worry about some of the things that President Putin was doing. For example, selling S-400 technology to the Chinese. I will just sum this up by saying I once talked to a former government official and I asked him whether he worried about this, and he looked at me and he said simply, "John, I'm from Altai." You all know where Altai is? Right on the Chinese border out there. And I know from a lot of other contacts that many people in the military and others are worried. Now that doesn't change official policy, but I think there's still people who can remember the 1969 fighting on the Amur River, and there's people who also worry that Russia is going to be the junior partner in this relationship, and that goes against all of Russian kind of ideology of being a leader in the world.
So Putin's regime is not as strong as it seems, but at the same time, of course, it's strong enough to last for a long time. And how they can do it? Of course, economic bribes, as they usually did previously, which is very difficult now because of not only sanctions, but mostly because of counter-sanctions, and even more importantly, because they're just very ineffective. They could increase the level of propaganda, which is also doubtful. As I said, it's already an unprecedented level. But what Putin can do and is doing is to increase the level of repressions. We have more than 300 political prisoners. We have people in jail, real terms, for just tweets, for free posts. As you asked about these military forces, yes, and they use created specially Russian Guard to crack down protests. Minister of Interior Amon is doing the same. We see this huge brutality against protesters in Moscow and many other regions, but instead, again, all the time before, we would think that it would sow fear. This is what Kremlin hopes to achieve. But instead, it's like a boomerang, and people are losing this fear because they're already in such situations. They're fed up with lies. They're tired of injustice. They don't live well. They see the difference of what is on TV and looking out of the window. Plus, again, as I said, Russian youth doesn't watch TV, and they are demanding for justice and for changes.
I actually think that Ambassador Tuft did a great job covering the Russia-China question. I would just add to it, yes, it's something to watch, absolutely, and it's absolutely true that the two countries have come closer together in cooperating in a number of spheres, but the historical issues between these two great nations are deep, and the tensions are underneath the surface. So we don't want to overhype what we're seeing, and we also don't want to lose sight of the fact that most of the issues on which they're cooperating, it's specifically to counter some sort of U.S. or Western initiative.
I just add a funny little story. A lot of Russians worried about Chinese in Central Asia and in the Far Eastern regions. I was told that several years ago there was the dedication of a big Chinese-built and run casino out near Vladivostok, near the airport. And the story that I heard was that all of the governor and the mayor and everyone were there, and the Chinese businessman who was the money man behind all of this got up and gave this speech where he was extolling how many thousands and thousands of Chinese were going to be coming to the Far Eastern region. And the individual who I heard this from said he watched the governor and the mayor get increasingly white and blanched.
Just one brief comment on the Russia-China. I think for the last couple of years, if you're in Russia, you hear a lot of this sort of on the propaganda about Russia moving towards east because the West is, closing doors to the West. So, okay, let's go and be friends with Chinese. And I don't think that really worked. It didn't work economically because China gets its bargain and Russia basically pays more. But also because I think Russia is historically, traditionally, culturally, is continuing to move towards the West. I think there's no other path other than Europe. So I wouldn't be afraid of Russia causing too much to China.
Since 1991, statistically, 20% of the people who live in the Russian Far Eastern regions have moved to Moscow and Petersburg. There's been that net decline. 20%. From 8 million down to 6, if I remember.
Can I use this more or less as an excuse to make a small comment? That is that the Russian military are becoming increasingly a political force in terms of public support, and the Russian military will have their own issues on this sort of thing. It's not, the Ministry of Defense is thoroughly militarized, it's not actually under full civilian control. And if you look at Putin's behavior towards the armed forces, it's not a force that he gives direction to. He didn't do the reforms himself. It's a force which I think he has some apprehensions about. And a future president, assuming, however, like Putin he is going to have, I think, apprehensions about what the armed forces might represent and do in the future.
We're running out of time, but let's try to get 3 here. Batu and then the 2 women in back there.
Thank you. I would like to get back to the two Russia issue. One quick joke and then a question. Maybe many of you heard this joke, but there is 2 things that Russians are dreaming of. America to be destroyed and to win a green card in a lottery. So, speaking of the to Russia, what's the, in general assessment, what's the ratio between those 2 Russias? So to rephrase my question, how many Russians think that Crimea is Ukraine, Abkhazia and South Ossetia is Georgia, and Ukraine and Georgia's NATO membership will be good for Russia? Thank you.
Pass it 2 rows back, Batu. Yeah, and then real quick, please.
Thank you. I had sort of same question. First of all, I'd like to welcome the panel and especially the freedom fighters from Russian Federation. And congratulations with this small victory, because it is important, because usually small victories make big victories, and let's hope for better. And my question, well, actually it was comment again, what Batu recently raised. It's about 2 Russians, because in Georgia, 2 Russians have a different connotation, and let me explain. Usually it comes together with the anti-Western and anti-Turkish propaganda. So this is the source of, within the framework of Russian hybrid warfare. So that's why we are careful of using that term, and instead how we view you, how we perceive you. We think that you are the freedom fighters, you are the persons who are very courageous, educated, and really brave people. And we have the common values with you. And that's why the question which was raised by, but I will emphasize that question. I'm asking the insider view, because I hope you have the, some communication with this new leadership, new generation in Russia. So what are their perceptions? Are Georgian territories, Georgian regions of Abkhazia, Georgian region of South Ossetia/Tskhinvali region, as well as Crimea Peninsula occupied? Because this is important question. Why? Because we had already this disillusionment. So excuse me for repeating once again this question. Thank you.
And that's it. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Katie Khachidze. I'm director of an NGO called Orbeliadi. My question is very quick. Do you think, is there a risk of breakup of Russia after Putin has gone? And is it actually in the interest of Georgia to see weaker Russia, given the risk of uncertainty in the North Caucasus?
So if I could ask each of you to be brief in answering and final comments. Natalia, do you want to start?
Yes. Thank you for these questions. It's important for us. We, pro-democracy Russians, we are now everywhere. We are inside the country fighting, and the grassroots movement is getting stronger and stronger. Actually, huge exodus of Putin's Russia recently after all these repressive laws and after annexation of Crimea, many people fled to Georgia, to Ukraine, to the US, and for all of us, of course, Crimea is Ukraine and South Ossetia, Abkhazia is Georgia. Never before we had such a global phenomenon of pro-democracy Russian movement, and what we are trying to do is to tell the truth about corrupt and criminal Putin's regime in our new countries where we are, and also to show again that there is another way, there is a free Russia. And so it's millions of us, I would say.
Two Russias, I think, again, I'm 2 years away, but when I was there, I had the sense that the two Russias were growing increasingly apart. And you could go through and describe this. And it's a generalization, so it breaks down at certain points. But, you know, there was a Russia that watched the Russian news and the Sunday night talk shows blasting the Americans and the Europeans and castigating the Ukrainians and all the opposition. And then there were the young people who watched, who did social media. And we, when I was ambassador, and I think this has continued at all the embassies, we're increasingly using the social media to reach out. I did press conferences on social media. We broadcast concerts, jazz concerts at Spaso House, and we got thousands of people would tune in to see these things. So we were trying very hard not to necessarily divide Russia. We were trying to make sure we were reaching as many, particularly the young people, as we possibly could.
I would only suggest we be slightly careful of the two Russia thesis. I think it should be certainly clear in our minds that there's an official Russia and an unofficial Russia. But on the question of the possible breakup of Russia, I think the outcome could be very dangerous indeed, and one can't tell exactly what would happen. I think the breakup of Russia is improbable and certainly is not in our interests, but it is a fear of many in Russia who would give Putin and people in the center support precisely because of that fear.
Former Secretary Mattis was just interviewed on this question quite recently, and the way that he characterized Russia is as a declining power, and he noted that declining powers can be more dangerous in the short term. I would also say that, you know, fragile states, weak states that are armed to the teeth, which is absolutely what Russia is, it is armed to the teeth, are destabilizing. So we have no interest in seeking, you know, destabilizing power that is fearful and is internally incoherent.
I would just say that majority of Russians don't want war. I think no matter how you look at the polls, surveys, it's hard to know whether they're telling the truth or not. But I think if you ask most Russians what they want, I think they will say just the things that all of you will say. They want normal, peaceful life. They want their kids to go to school. They want food in the stores. They want good relations with neighbors. I don't think in Russia today, and I think Putin knows this, Kremlin knows this, that most Russians are not interested in military operations abroad, and that's why Putin is hiding behind people like Prigozhin and in some of his military adventures. So I would not worry about I mean, Russian society has a lot of problems and issues, but I wouldn't worry about Russian people as being aggressive towards its neighbors. I think it will normalize when we get this crooks out of Kremlin.
Ladies and gentlemen, in concluding, let me just say this panel had something that was very unexpected and something that was very expected. The unexpected was the little show we had at the start, but I'm glad that's over and hopefully it won't be repeated. The expected thing was the 5 panelists did a stellar job. They were terrific. Please join me in thanking them.